Thank you very much, Konstantinos, and a huge thanks to the Delphi Economic Forum for this amazing event in only its third year in existence, and for partnering with the European Leadership Network for this panel. The ELN is 180 heavyweight public figures from all across Europe, from Dublin to Moscow, working for better security in wider Europe. A big thanks to my speakers too, some of whom I have corralled into this event. Will we see a marked improvement in Russia-West relations? I think not. I'm going to focus mainly on the defense and security aspects of the relationship because I think those are fundamental. And I'm going to look a lot at US-Russia relations because I think those are key. It is possible, of course, to dream of sunlit uplands in the relationship. Trump might have been a better US president for these relations than Hillary Clinton. He might have dragged his allies into warmer relations with Moscow, jumping the rails of confrontation. And President Putin, in his legacy last term, might next month start with statesmanship in eastern Ukraine. But realistically, there is much to say that the relationship will remain troubled for years to come. I would identify just 4 of many possible arguments for this. One is that the patient is weak. It's had pneumonia for 40 or 70 years, depending on how you care to measure it. It had a recurrence in 2008, which it briefly recovered from. But the virus, the habit of West-Russia confrontation is strong. And European doctors who might fix it are very divided on the appropriate medication. Second, we're still digging on both sides this hole. Putin's speech yesterday was, day before, was a gift to the US nuclear posture review and vice versa. The confrontation is increasingly invested. Look how much both sides are promising to their military-industrial complexes, if only for nuclear. It's increasingly institutionalized, whether that's sanctions or military doctrines, and I can say that because I watched it as British ambassador to NATO until the end of 2016, getting increasingly structured. And the road back is ever harder. The NATO-Russia Council is not working. The Iran nuclear deal teeters on the brink. INF is contested, etc. A third reason is, if I can put this unkindly about my own community, Western hubris is still too strong, or Western alarm about the situation is still too weak for there to be a real political will to move and give Russia the attention and respect it craves. And finally, and I think this is hard to argue with, the status quo gives a better cost-benefit outcome for both Western and Russian leaderships. So the relationship is going to continue to be troubled. But my next point is that doesn't mean to say if we're not scared enough about the relationship that it is not dangerous and costly. In other words, I think we need to be more scared. For Putin, we are perhaps replaying the 1970s model. Dramatic nuclear buildup gets US attention, leading to respectful arms control between the two great superpowers, making Russia feel good again. For the United States, it's perhaps the 1980s model. Outspend, and out-vaunt Russia, and in the end, that model doesn't work very well for Russia. I think it's actually the 1950s. We're running up to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The capacity for misreading each other is greater than during the Cold War. So is the capacity for misjudgment, because we spend less time thinking about each other and analyzing each other. The capacity for miscalculation is high in the NATO and Russian military doctrines, which are geared for mutual escalation in the early stages of any crisis. And accidents can happen, as we saw with Turkey's shoot down of a Russian fighter aircraft in November 2015. But it isn't really the 1950s, although I think we should be scared about that. It's actually the 2020s, or it will soon be, this confrontation, and that's even worse. A much greater degree of opacity and deliberate ambiguity, an incredibly fast pace of technology for which there are no rules in the military domain, creating both complexity and tremendous pace that modern decision makers have to deal with, and an eroding and violated set of arms control regimes that are really worse than having none at all, because they leave each side unhappy with the other. And so my last point, troubled the relationship will be, dangerous and costly it certainly will be. Regrettably, we are not alarmed enough about it. But that doesn't mean that nothing can be done. There are plenty of small steps that might lead to larger ones. Let me just pick out 4. One is the need for what you might call guarded engagement or disciplined dialogue. It is absurd that NATO is not talking seriously to Russia, and that the US-Russia dialogue is so sporadic and inadequate. Second, the two sides could do worse than trying the Reagan-Gorbachev trick of some early declaratory diplomatic moves, declaring, for example, that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, since both sides seem so fixated on nuclear. That seems a good place to start. Third, it is possible to try harder on the places where wrong turnings have been taken in the West-Russia relationship. There is a small window for movement on eastern Ukraine, somewhere between April and September this year, and you never know. And I think that it behooves the United States and NATO to have another go with Russia on ballistic missile defense, something that perhaps absurdly but absolutely genuinely preoccupies the Russian military class. And finally, it's worth attempting to draw a few boundaries. The NATO-Russia Founding Act is on life support, but it might be possible to discuss that key phrase in it, that NATO will not deploy substantial combat forces, and the two sides could negotiate what that might look like. And there is a pressing need for some understandings about not using offensive cyber capabilities against strategic nuclear capabilities. That's a small and modest menu for those who retain any interest in salvaging this relationship to get started on. Thank you.